My brother and I were staying at a cabin in a secluded valley in northern Montana, nestled among the trees. Since we were both very outdoorsy, this was a typical trip for us, spent hiking and exploring the woods. After the long drive, we took the first day easy, relaxing around the cabin and enjoying the scenery. Around 5:30, Johnny decided to go for a short walk before dark. I barely looked up as he left, just saying, "All right," and noticing he hadn't taken a pack. I lay down on the couch near the fireplace, dozing off from the exhaustion of the drive. The cabin grew progressively darker as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Only when the fire was the sole source of light did I realize Johnny still wasn't back. It was far too dark to be out without gear. I grabbed my day pack, a headlamp, and a flashlight, and headed out to find him. My initial fear was the local bear population, making me nervous for his safety. However, as I moved deeper along the trail, my anxiety began to shift toward a different, unnamed concern. A bad feeling made me glance over my shoulder repeatedly, expecting to see someone, though I never did. About 10 minutes down the path, I spotted Johnny approaching. He looked unsettled, moving at a brisk, purposeful walk as if trying to get away from something without running. We both started talking at once, me asking what was wrong and him urging me to turn back to the cabin. We quickly hurried back inside, where he explained he had seen a man watching him from the trees, a creepy figure who seemed to be stalking him along the trail. Johnny reasoned that if he had returned in daylight, the man might have followed him, so he waited for darkness. Being the older brother, he assured me it was probably nothing, just being cautious. I trusted him and tried to dismiss it, thinking the man was likely just a local hiker or a neighbor. We made dinner and spent the rest of the evening on the front porch by a campfire, both of us subtly watching the tree line for any sign of a watcher, though neither admitted it. The mountains grew quieter as the night deepened. We talked by the fire for hours before finally going inside to sleep. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, we left for the main hike, a 6-hour trek to a nearby peak. We returned completely exhausted, the final walk back to the cabin feeling endless. Inside, Johnny dropped his bag and announced he was taking a shower. With only one bathroom, I waited on the couch. After just a minute, I suddenly remembered the man from the day before. I got up and looked out the windows, half expecting to see him, then returned to the couch, feeling strangely uneasy. A few minutes later, I realized the shower's water pump hadn't kicked on. I called for Johnny. There was no answer. I walked down the hall to the bedroom, knocked, and called his name again. An unsettling feeling washed over me as I cracked the door open. Peering through the gap, I saw Johnny kneeling in the corner, his eyes wide with terror, subtly shaking his head no. The sheer fear in his expression is burned into my memory, a horrifying sight I wish I could forget. I pushed the door open fully to see a man standing a few feet from him. The man had wide, tired, and disturbing eyes, wearing torn, disheveled clothes with long, oily black hair. I didn't think. I just reacted, charging at him. Only as I got closer did I see him raise a gun from his side. I tackled him, and Johnny instantly joined in. We managed to wrestle the gun away and subdue him, though he fought like a feral animal, screeching and clawing to escape. He wouldn't stop struggling, so it took us a moment to form a plan. Johnny, being bigger, held him down while I got the car ready. I rushed outside, threw our bags, still packed from the hike, into the car and started the engine. I went back in, and we used whatever we could find in the cabin to tie him up just enough for us to get away, taking the gun with us. We could hear his screams from inside as we drove off. Once we had cell service, we notified the police, but when they reached the cabin, they found only the shredded remains of his bindings on the floor. The man was gone. Johnny later told me that when he went to shower, the man ambushed him, holding him at gunpoint and ordering him to call me in. Johnny refused, not want to lead me into a trap, but I walked in anyway. We still talk about how insane it was that I tackled him. I can't explain the impulse, but it likely saved our lives. The only clue the authorities have is the gun we gave them. It was registered to a man who had been missing for 5 years from about 50 miles away. Based on our description of our attacker, it didn't seem to be the same person, leading us to believe our assailant had likely attacked the gun's original owner, leaving him as a missing person. It's a chilling thought that if things had gone differently, that could have been mine and Johnny's fate as well. In 2016, I traveled to my father's old cabin, a 6-hour drive into the woods near his derelict hometown, which was now just a row of abandoned buildings on a deserted road. We never visited because he said there was no reason after the town died, but after he passed, I wanted to see the home he built. I knew it would be dilapidated, and I hoped to do some restoration work, just to preserve it for a while longer. I also hoped the trip would offer some peace and quiet to clear my head. I drove there, parking behind an old gas station and hiking the rugged 2-mile trail to the cabin. I had my backpacking gear and tools, prepared to camp in a tent if the structure had collapsed. Fortunately, I found it still standing in a small clearing, a simple rectangular log cabin with vines climbing the walls. The door had no lock, and the interior was a mess, filled with scattered trash and a musty smell. It was clear someone had squatted here at some point, though not recently. I pushed what I could into a corner to make space, and as the sun set, I unrolled my sleeping bag and settled in. I should mention that although I saw and heard nothing that night, I couldn't sleep for more than 30 minutes at a time, constantly waking with a strange, disturbing feeling that made for a terrible night. I got up at sunrise, groggy and questioning the entire trip. After brewing coffee on my camp stove, I took a walk through the still dark woods to clear my head. I found a hill that served as an overlook above the tree line, thinking it a perfect spot to watch the sunrise. But I saw something else, a light in one of the far-off abandoned town's buildings. It went out a minute later. I worried about my car, but figured it was just urban explorers. A big coincidence, but likely nothing. After an hour, I returned to start work on the cabin, beginning with resealing and cleaning the exterior. The whole time, that same eerie feeling from the night loomed over me. It took a while to identify, but I eventually understood. I felt like I wasn't alone. I kept working but glanced over my shoulder constantly, knowing it was genuinely impossible for anyone else to be out here in these random woods with nothing but a decaying cabin, chalking it up to being on edge. Once the sun went down, I headed inside and got the old wood stove going, grateful it still worked. I sat by it, watching the flames and thinking about my dad and this trip. Later, the fire's crackles were joined by a similar sound from outside, cracks and crunches approaching the front door. I listened, realizing it wasn't an animal, but a person. Just as they reached the door, the stove seemed to roar, drowning out the sounds outside. Then they knocked and called out my dad's name, a moment that froze my world. How'd he know my dad? In complete shock, I stood on the other side of the door and called out, asking who he was. He hesitated, likely realizing I wasn't my father. He claimed to be an old friend of the man who built the cabin, hoping to see him again. I felt a strong urge to open the door and talk to someone who knew my dad, but something held me back. I asked why he was here, and he said he lived in the old town. After a moment, I shared that I was his son and that he had passed away. The man paused, then said he was sorry and wished he could have seen him one more time. Initially, this felt nice, but I quickly sensed something off in his voice, a lack of the expected sadness. Before I could speak, as if he knew I was doubting him, he asked me to open up, saying it was cold and suggesting we share the fire. Though he spoke slowly, I detected an impatient urgency. A feeling told me he wasn't being truthful. Sure, he knew my dad's name and was from his town, but was he really a friend? As I struggled for words, he asked again, knocking more harshly, his voice growing less kind and more demanding. I backed away from the door. He knocked again, yelling, "Kid, open the door. You gonna let me die out here in the cold? That what your father would want from you?" My heart pounded as I dug for my hunting knife. He continued hitting the door and yelling subtle threats, shedding his fake, harmless persona. This nightmare felt endless, until he suddenly punched the door in anger, and I heard his footsteps retreating into the woods. I stayed up all night, terrified and waiting. At sunrise, with no sign of him, I hurriedly packed and ran from the cabin. I was lucky to find my car untouched and hidden behind the gas station. I fled town and drove nonstop back home. I had hoped the trip would provide answers or help me come to terms with things, but I'm just left with more questions. I realized I never truly knew why my dad moved away. I'd assumed it was because the town was dying, but now I think there was more to it, other reasons he never brought me back. I don't know why that man was there, what he really wanted, or how he knew my dad, but I'm certain his intentions weren't good. Had I let my emotions win and open that door, I genuinely don't think I would have ever made it out of that town. This was back in 2014 during a gap year from college, while I was traveling across the US out of my car. When I reached the East Coast, my cousin offered to let me stay at his cabin just south of the Appalachian Mountains. I accepted, looking forward to a real place to rest for a few days. The cabin was quite nice, feeling more like a modern vacation home than a typical rustic log cabin deep in the woods. I was honestly a little surprised my cousin was letting me stay there for free. I began moving my things from the car into the cabin, and when I went back out for the last load, I noticed someone watching me from the tree line. They were far off the path, and with nothing else in view, they had to be looking at me. I figured they might not have meant to be creepy, and since I didn't know the area, there could easily have been other cabins hidden past the trees. I grabbed the rest of my stuff, locked my car, and brought it inside, noticing the man was still out there facing the cabin as I closed the door. I texted my cousin to say I'd arrived, and also mentioned someone was watching me, just asking if he knew who it might be. He texted back while I was unpacking, but I didn't check it until almost an hour later, well after sunset. He informed me the cabin was on 40 acres of his fenced-in property and that no one else should have been out there. That immediately made me feel much worse about what I'd seen. Before, I hadn't cared much, but now it was deeply strange that someone was on the private property just staring from a distance. I looked outside again, but beyond the cabin's lights, it was pitch black. I couldn't even see the tree line, just complete darkness all around. It gave me a chill as I closed the curtains. I tried to relax by watching a movie in the bedroom. It helped occupy my mind, but didn't completely relieve my unease. About an hour in, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I looked, locking my gaze on the window where there was a gap in the curtains. I thought I saw something move, but all I could see was my blurry reflection and the darkness behind it. I quickly got up and started toward the window when I suddenly heard footsteps sprinting through the grass. By the time I looked out, I couldn't see anything and could only faintly hear the footsteps fading into the dark. I immediately called my cousin. I'm not sure why I didn't call the police first, but he told me to, so I hung up and had them on the way within a minute. Considering how remote the cabin was, the officer arrived in a decent amount of time. However, the man who had been watching me was long gone, and we both quickly realized there wasn't much he could do. He couldn't search the woods and could only really act if the guy showed up again and stayed long enough for him to return. So, I was left alone again. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling for the rest of the night. I considered leaving, but the thought of carrying all my stuff to the car in the dark was more unsettling than just hunkering down inside. Of course, I kept looking out the windows repeatedly, even though I couldn't see a thing for the last hour before bed. It must have been midnight or 1 a.m. And I was just pacing the house, double-checking everything and trying to feel safe enough to sleep. I think I was putting it off as long as I could, but it was inevitable. I had to rest. I turned off all the lights, headed to the bedroom, and locked myself in. I hoped the worst was over and got into bed, falling asleep about 30 minutes later. I woke up very early, far too early for it to be right. The sun wasn't up yet, so it had to be around 4 a.m. Meaning I'd only slept a few hours. Almost immediately, my mind snapped back into a panic, and I felt the need to check the cabin again. There was no way I could go back to sleep without walking around to make sure I was still safe. I got up, turned on the hallway light, and listened for a moment. I didn't hear anything but the heavy wind against the thin windows. I started walking, but only got halfway down the hall before hearing something else. It sounded like a couple of thumps from the far end of the cabin, where there was a small library in the kitchen. I crept closer, and in the hallway light, I could see the shadow of something moving. I froze, unwilling to believe the situation, but the shadow suddenly stopped. A few seconds passed. Then it slowly started moving again before a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Just from its shape, I knew it was the same man I had seen in the trees. I turned around, ran back, and locked myself in the bedroom. The silence that followed was deafening. I expected him to chase me, attack, or break down the door, but it was just silent. I could hear my heart pounding. Then a few slow footsteps moved down the hall, right up to the other side of the door, and the man just stood out there. I clenched my phone, wanted to call for help, but fearing he would hear me and decide to speed up whatever he had planned. So instead, I made the split-second decision to grab my keys, open the window, and make a run for my car. I got in and sped away from the cabin. When it was all over, the police arrived and found no one. The man had entered through a window on the far end with a broken lock. Whether he broke it or was already broken is unknown. The cops also found the bedroom door open. Its lock was just a standard push-button kind. Regardless, that meant the man was prepared to open the door and was going to at any minute. So, if I had stayed and waited for the police, I wouldn't have gotten out so easily. What's really strange is that he was there from the moment I arrived, which likely means he'd been watching the place for a while, maybe waiting for me or someone to show up. What he truly intended, I luckily never had to find out.